Good evening to those of you in the East. Good afternoon to those of you in the center of the country and on the West Coast. And good morning to those of you in Asia. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome participants from 38 venues in the United States and Greater China to our second annual Chinatown Hall, National Reflections, Local Connections. The Olympic torch relay, the Olympics themselves, elections in Taiwan, violence in Tibet, record trade deficits, sovereign wealth funds, defective toys, tainted medicine, job losses, a slumping U.S. economy, all of these issues put China on the front page of newspapers, the cover of magazines, and have made China the top story on the evening news over the last few months. All the presidential candidates acknowledge that improved U.S.-China relations is America's most important 21st century international priority. But discussion of U.S.-China relations in the campaign for president, for the Senate, and for the House has been very limited. The conclusion of our primary season, the opening of the Olympics in Beijing in August, the commencement of the Democratic Convention the day after the closing ceremony of the Olympics, and 1 week later, the Republican Convention, followed by 9 weeks of campaigning toward the November general election, will focus more attention on America's policy toward China. To help us prepare for this important election period and time of public discussion about U.S.-China relations, we have with us one of America's foremost experts on Congress and the presidency, Norm Ornstein. Before turning it over to Norm, let me thank our partners in all of our venues for helping us put this program together, and our small but very dedicated National Committee staff that has done a terrific job in coordinating this nationwide event. Let me also thank our local speakers. None of them are paid, and they have traveled throughout the United States to talk with you about China in the shared belief that education of Americans about China leads to better policies. Let me thank the Star Foundation for providing the funding for this immense undertaking. And last, but certainly not least, let me thank Norm Ornstein. Simply put, we could not have a better analyst to discuss these issues with us today. Let me turn it over to Norm and add that after his opening remarks, Norm will be answering email questions from all of our venues. We will get through as many of them as we can, but I apologize in advance to those questions we don't have a chance to answer. Norm?
Thanks so much, Steve. I was in Asia last week, and this is a venue in which I watch movies. It's the only place I do. And there were two that kind of typify the American presidential campaign up until now. On the Democratic side, it was There Will Be Blood. And for the fall campaign, the Democrats will run against John McCain, of course, No Country for Old Men. We have quite interesting contest in what is, I believe, and I think many would share the belief, the most consequential presidential election in our lifetimes, and perhaps the most unusual. Unusual first because it's the first election in 80 years where we did not have at any stage a president or vice president running for the office, meaning from the beginning, and the beginning, of course, was more than 4 years ago. We have a permanent campaign that never ends. We had wide open contests in both parties and quite fluid contests. At the same time, of course, as we know, we're going to have a path-breaking winner no matter what. We are either going to have the first African-American president, the first woman president, or the oldest president in the history of the country. So all of that is extraordinary, and it's extraordinary as well because I believe it is no exaggeration to say that the country's at a crossroads in many respects, and Americans believe this as well. A crossroads in domestic terms, economic policy with a fiscal crisis that looms ahead, without revenues that can match any of the demands for spending. In international terms, not only with the challenge in the Middle East and Iraq and Iran, but also coming up with some kind of consensus that defines what role America will play in the world and how it will relate to our allies, our adversaries, and those who fall somewhere in between, and a time when Americans desperately want change. Let me step back for a minute and just talk a little bit about the larger landscape, and then talk a little bit about the political dynamics that flow from that. The first and most important thing to put on the table is that Americans on the whole are angry and unhappy. You can even call the public mood, if you'd like, although the term is perilous, bitter. But we'll avoid that, at least for the moment. The fact is that on a range of issues, but first and foremost on the economy, we have an extraordinary level of unhappiness. We have 81% of Americans saying that the country is on the wrong track. Now, the question, do you think America is moving in the right direction or seriously off on the wrong track, has been asked for decades. This 81% is the highest number in the 35 or 40 years since pollsters have been asking the question. We have 90% of Americans who say that the economy is in serious trouble. And we have, looking at another indicator, the University of Michigan, which has asked questions for more than 50 years, almost 60 years, that reflect a level of confidence that voters have as consumers. The consumer confidence number is the lowest in more than a quarter century and among the lowest since the 1950s. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that these numbers are obviously at this terrible low point now because the economy is in serious trouble. Almost everybody, including most of the policymakers, say that we are in a recession. Technically or not remains to be proven, but we are in a recession. We know that we have a terrible credit crunch. We know that we have a mortgage problem. We know that there are other difficulties that flow from all of that. Job creation is down and all of those things. But even a year ago, when the economy was more robust, we had 2/3 of Americans saying we were off on the wrong track. People were not optimistic. We have a change, frankly, in public attitudes that used to be a direct and pretty strong correlation between objective indicators of economic performance and a public sense of optimism. That's no longer there. And the reason, to use the catch-all phrase, as much as anything, is globalization and its effects. But to put it in a nutshell, even for those Americans who've been doing pretty well, who are reasonably confident about their own prospects, the sense of unease that you can no longer count on things for any length of time, that there's no safety net anymore to protect people, that in particular, health and pension benefits are up in the air for people, is palpable. And of course, a part of the reason for this is that American companies, which, unlike many other societies, provide the bulk of the health and pension benefits for citizens, they're not done by the government or the society as a whole, are under tremendous pressure as a consequence of that in the global marketplace. And they're looking for ways to push down those costs. We have companies that go out of business, companies that go into bankruptcy and use the protection of the bankruptcy laws to adjust health and pension benefits for employees and retirees. And then we have lots of other people who are in the same situation that I'm in, which is every year my employer, and I'm pretty secure, says, you know, the costs have gone up so much we have to adjust. New plan, more out-of-pocket expenses, you can't use the same doctors, a very unpleasant time. So all of that has led to or exacerbated the unhappiness. Throw in high gas prices now, the sense of inflation therefore is high. And all of that leads to a mood that is angry but also has a very populist sense to it, something that I'm going to come back to in a minute. Now, of course, the war is another factor here. It's been supplanted by the economy. It has been damped down a little bit by the surge, which has had an impact, but you still have a majority of Americans who believe that we made a mistake getting in and we ought to get out. And then we've got a palpable anger in the country about Washington and a belief that Washington isn't working. The presidency, the Congress, all of the actors in Washington basically are more interested in throwing mud pies at each other than in solving the problems that people face in their everyday lives. Now, that anger towards Washington has led to George Bush's lowest approval ratings of his presidency and among the lowest ever recorded for an incumbent president, now averaging about 28%. Approval ratings for Congress are lower yet, and the lowest in many decades at around 22%. The Congress is controlled by the Democrats. But it's important to realize that the public anger, which hits everybody, hits Republicans more. The sense in the country is that it's the Republicans who've been in charge, and it is time for a change. And if Americans could have a referendum today and fast forward, or TiVo, through the next 10 months, and just move on, past this administration, past this political time, that would pass overwhelmingly. Now, this is a terrain which is more favorable for Democrats than Republicans. And just to talk for a minute or two about the current presidential dynamic, first on the Democratic side, as we near the pivotal, perhaps, Pennsylvania primary on April 22nd, there is a contest, but frankly, Barack Obama has an extraordinary margin here and is probably has close to a 90% chance of winning the Democratic nomination. It may be over on April 23rd. It is more likely to be over after the primaries in Indiana and North Carolina on May the 6th. It may go to June the 3rd or 4th when the last contest takes place. And if he melts down in some fashion, which he shows no signs of doing, it could go all the way to the convention. But it is very likely that he will be the nominee. And despite all of the difficulties, including this terrible bickering on the Democratic side, which has caused divisions and caused up to a quarter of the Obama supporters or the Clinton supporters to say that they won't vote for the other if their rival wins, it's still a terrain in which I would much rather be in the Democratic nominee's shoes than that of John McCain, the Republican, although I also believe that John McCain is the strongest candidate Republicans could put up in a year when you need to look as if you're not going to be a third George Bush term, and when you need to have some appeal to independents and Democrats to be able to prevail. Now, having said that, let's talk a little bit about what all of this terrain and dynamic means for the issue of China in the campaign and the difficulty that President Bush, in his remaining months, will have when the dialogue is going to be dominated by that of the campaign and not so much by what he says or does. It's not surprising, perhaps, under these circumstances, particularly with the unhappiness the voters have about economic issues, the sense of unease about America's role in the world, and the populism that I talked about earlier, that China has become a convenient target for political candidates. For the presidential candidates, particularly on the Democratic side, after all, they're the ones who want to criticize Bush's policies, and to a lesser extent, even with John McCain, with congressional candidates as well, and also for Democrats, frankly, because the national security issue is one where, of course, John McCain has his greatest comparative advantage, not perhaps by supporting an unpopular war in Iraq, but because of his long experience and the strong sense that he's a tough leader who will stand up against our adversaries or evil people trying to kill us. Democrats want to show that they can be tough too. And the other side of that is John McCain wants to play to the anti-communist element, which is still a significant one within the Republican Party, and show that he's for human rights. So you look at the issues that you discussed at the beginning of our broadcast and think about Tibet, Darfur, also a significant issue, Burma, an issue for a significant number of people out there, particularly on the Democratic activist side, and they're trying to appeal to Democratic activists now. And then you take the stories that have been in the press about China on the economic front, whether it is a more esoteric one, at least for most voters, but still resonates, the question of currency manipulation, but all the way through tainted medicines, lead in toys, and up through the questions of whether our trade policies are benefiting others at the expense of the rest of us. And China becomes a target. And we have seen this. We've seen it with an extraordinary set of speeches that Senator Clinton has given throughout Pennsylvania, where she started by focusing on the need to get tough with China. Part of a campaign pitch that includes we're going to renegotiate NAFTA and we're going to oppose other free trade agreements like the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, but with as much or more of an emphasis on China and the litany of things that I've mentioned as anything else. And we've had Senator Obama raise the China question when the trade issue comes up as well. They're not talking so much about trade with other countries. They're looking for an example, Exhibit A big trading issue, but one where you can get some traction by pointing out that you're trying to protect America's children against lead, that you're trying to protect people from being killed by medicines that are tainted, by hitting the administration for not supervising adequately the plants and the big corporations making money by outsourcing the production of medicines to China. It is a tempting target. And of course, with the Olympics coming up, it is particularly tempting to show that you're going to be tough and you're going to make China pay attention to America's concerns by hitting them where it hurts. So the idea that the candidates would be calling, as Clinton and Obama have, for President Bush to boycott the opening ceremonies is not terribly surprising at all. If there's anything that's surprising here, to be frank, it is that they've limited their calls to the opening ceremonies and not called for something more significant. There, I do think that the experience that we had with the boycott of the Olympics in Moscow will have something to do with it. But I expect that those calls for taking some significant action will ratchet up if there is any more bad news coming out of Tibet, or if the Falun Gong raise any more questions and we get an additional crackdown, or if we get any more incidents as the one which hit the front pages of our major papers of China imprisoning a blogger for expressing his views. All of those stories that suggest problems in the political process in China are fodder for a campaign where candidates are trying to get traction with particular constituencies now, especially on the Democratic side, but more generally in the fall. And all of this makes a more difficult terrain for the president as he tries, for example, to maintain his commitment to attend those opening ceremonies. So that's where we are now, and it's going to make for some difficulty, and it's one of the reasons why the National Committee's role is so important in trying to get us to step back and focus on the larger questions. As China emerges as such an enormously important player, how do we interact with China, and how do we develop a set of relationships that are constructive for us and America's national interest over the long run, and not focus on such short-term things?
Norm, thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. Let me kick it off with one question, and then we've already received a few dozen questions from the various venues, which I will then get to, which is, do you think China will play the extension of the primary process, the drawing out of the Democratic primary process has, I think, changed the focus on China, that it's because of the constituencies. Will it play differently when the general election campaign is underway?
It may play a little bit differently when we get to the general election campaign, but frankly, Steve, not a lot differently. If we had not had this extended contest going through all the way through, and particularly into these difficult states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, with Indiana to follow, it might have been a little bit different, because then the Democratic candidate would have been positioning himself or herself more towards the middle at an earlier point, and looking for some running room at a point when you might indeed become president. But now that we have candidates on the record repeatedly on these issues, they're not going to change, and they aren't likely to get off of them. And then keep in mind one further thing, which is any projection we have about where the economy is going between now and the fall campaign is likely to be more pessimistic rather than optimistic. Things get a little tougher economically. There is no incentive to take the foot off the pedal in critiquing China and its role in the economic world, at least.
Let me take the first question from Waterville, Maine. Will the proximity of the conventions to the Olympics force issues about China into the campaign discourse?
I do think that having the Olympics so close to the conventions, which means that the Olympics will be on the minds of people, may very well play out in some of the speeches given at the convention, and it may well play out in the politics leading up to the conventions. But so much of that is going to depend on what happens in the real world as we approach the Olympics. Whether, in fact, President Bush finds himself either forced to or deciding to boycott the opening ceremonies, or whether we decide to look for other ways to express ourselves, or whether something happens in China or elsewhere during the Olympics that provides another element of fodder.
From New York, why is there such a negative perception of China in the domestic U.S., both among the general public and congressional policymakers?
Well, I think that's a fairly easy one to answer. One point to keep in mind here is go back to the last time when we had a kind of populist movement, the late 1980s. And the 1988 presidential campaign, we had a number of Democratic candidates out there. Michael Dukakis, of course, was the ultimate winner. We also had Al Gore. We had Dick Gephardt. The Gephardt campaign in particular ran very much on a populist theme. And there, the focus was Japan. It was Japan and automobiles. It was a sense that trade was working to our disadvantage, that others were basically sticking it to us as we were hapless and naive. And it wasn't just trade. It was also, if you'll recall, all that Japanese money coming in and buying up American assets. Rockefeller Center and other places. Now, we can look back on it now and say, that was great for America because they bought real estate and other things at inflated prices and often ended up selling them at huge losses. But now we've got a similar set of phenomena. Americans, when they read about China, now read about people dying because a blood thinner medication was tainted, children at risk because of lead in toys or lead in toothpaste that could affect all of us. Or they're reading about sovereign wealth funds moving in and buying up our assets and buying them in ways that may endanger our national security. One of the things that Senator Clinton mentioned in a speech that she's given recently was China buying a company producing a particularly sophisticated magnet and ending up taking the jobs to China and then taking the technology there. So that we might end up, as the administration stands by idly, she said, not only losing jobs, but shipping off important technology for national security. You know, we had China attempt to buy an oil company. All of these things are in the news. And then you throw in Tibet and Darfur, and it's not surprising that people are developing a negative sense of China, or that politicians would exploit it.
Well, next question is from Sarasota, Florida. Do you agree with Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, who asked President Bush to boycott the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics?
Personally, I don't agree with that. I think that these gestures are symbolic and foolish, and this one, it seems to me, would be counterproductive. We know that the Olympics are extremely important for China. We also know that the Chinese people see this as an extremely important thing. It ends up, when you look at the cost-benefit ratio of anything that might occur from this, the backlash that we'll get from the Chinese for taking a step like this, it seems to me, can't possibly be less than whatever benefit might accrue from taking a stand. So I wouldn't do it. I'm not sure, frankly, if I had been President Bush, knowing what was likely to happen in the political contest, that I would have agreed to go to the opening ceremonies. We haven't had a president who's gone to the opening ceremonies, just to avoid a potential train wreck ahead. But I hope it doesn't happen. I hope we don't do this. And yet, you know, if I were a presidential candidate out there now, my first goal is winning, given everything that I've said and what we know is true in the terrain. I'm not sure I could avoid the temptation of calling for a boycott either.
Rather than being a strong leader and standing up and saying, the consequences of this action would so far outweigh any benefit that the United States would receive that I shouldn't follow the politically expedient way, which would be the,
yes.
I mean, I think those in the China community are virtually unanimous. Even the Dalai Lama saying, don't boycott. It's counterproductive. You will get nothing from the Chinese, but you will create an anti, whether it's the French, British, or Americans. But the candidates don't seem to be willing to stand up and say, leadership is about tough decisions.
I think we would see it handled differently if we had a nominee at this point. This is one of the consequences of a nominating process that skews things, not just geographically, but because of activist communities. Now, there is another element here, and I think Obama has tried to steer this course a little bit more than Clinton by saying, let's wait and see, because one thing a candidate doesn't want to do is get so far out front on this, saying as eloquently as you did why this would be counterproductive, and then find that there's some other massive problem that occurs, an embarrassment that makes you look bad. But leadership is not something we look for, unfortunately, even with candidates who profess to be different, when you've got tough contests and you're just trying to get through and win a nomination.
Well, here's a question that I think hits a similar theme. It's from Berkeley. Why can't people, candidates, officials, journalists, pundits, seem to appreciate that China, like the United States, is complicated and not easy to fit into neat boxes? That it is not surprising that the Chinese government and people bristle at easy and often distorting generalizations used to score cheap political points. I'm reading this from Berkeley.
Well, the answer is yes, you're right. Look, let's face it. The press is not very helpful in this case, but these days, given the nature of the press, it's not very helpful in many areas. You know, the so-called mainstream press is hurting. The network news is a dinosaur, basically, and the network news divisions are just basically trying to stay alive, and they're trying to do it often by focusing on their personalities. As we saw in the debate last night, they make it more about them than they do about the news. Nuance in news is just not something that we're seeing much anymore. The cable news operations are more interested in having somebody at one end screaming at somebody at the other than they are at doing analysis. So it's very tough. And it's made tougher by the fact that these issues do arise, and the Chinese are not pursuing some of their policies, including the rather inept and inopportune jail sentence for somebody for writing something they didn't like, just at a point where it would raise some of these issues to a fever pitch. But what you hope is that you can have a campaign where sensible policymakers leave themselves at least enough running room to be able to govern more with balance, instead of getting so far out on a limb. And rhetoric does have a way of becoming reality that they can't do much beyond that.
It's a perfect segue into the next question from Pullman, Washington. If I could look beyond the elections for a moment to look how a new administration and Congress will govern during the next term, we've come to expect a certain degree of China rhetoric during campaigns, but when one looks at how administrations have managed the China relationship, there has been a relative consistency of policies since normalizations of relations between the two countries. Do you see any particular issue on the horizon that could potentially change this pattern during the next administration?
I think there are a lot of issues that potentially could do it, but I don't think it's very likely that it will happen that way. We've got some larger questions here that need some focus. While the policies have not changed through most administrations, I do believe that basically in the last 5 years, we have not had a serious focus in the administration on U.S. relations with China from top to bottom. The interrelationship between the economic and the geopolitical. Serious questions about how we can engage China in a way that reflects and respects its growing and highly significant role in the world, while also trying to move China to a point where it has more of a sensitivity and recognition that as an emerging power in the world, the short-term economic interests in places in Africa, for example, ought to be balanced against the need to be a more responsible actor on the international scene. And Darfur and Burma are good examples of that. You know, part of it is, frankly, that an administration can only handle at the top levels 2 crises at one point. And, you know, almost all of the energies of the president, the vice president, and the other top policymakers have been devoted to Iraq and Iran and then the Middle East. So we need to have some serious thought about this. And the campaign is not a good place to do it. But you don't want an administration to take a year or more in what will be a very difficult time, because we have all of these issues, including, you know, crunch points in foreign policy, including Taiwan, which we haven't mentioned, North Korea, where you'd like to have them have some grounding going in. I hope we can get some of this done, not by the candidates, but during this remaining several months, perhaps by the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate and the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. And one of the things I'm hoping that we can do is to get Joe Biden and Dick Lugar, who work very well together and who have consonant views in these things, to use the venue of Congress to begin to get us to refocus and to get back to some of those questions that we had raised earlier. Why can't we see China in a more nuanced way? Howard Berman could do the same thing in the House. And then we've got to get a transition that begins much earlier than the one we normally have, and find a way, perhaps in a debate, and a different kind of debate than the really bad one we had on ABC last night. And I hope we'll get more than the 3 debates in the fall, but one that might focus on foreign policy and perhaps one on China that will get them thinking about how important this is.
I mean, you mentioned Taiwan, the elections in Taiwan. I think a lot of people in the China community see as a titanic shift in kind of cross-strait relations and therefore ultimately in U.S.-China relations. There has barely been a sentence on that in the campaign.
And let's face it, there has barely been a mention of it in the newspapers or on television. It has been enormously significant. I mean, the fact is, if the election had gone the other way, we might have it very much in the news, because it would be another flashpoint and another point of leverage right now in the short run, driving a wedge between the U.S. and China and creating more of an opportunity for candidates to call for tough action.
In 1990, this one is from New Haven. In 1992, Bill Clinton, as candidate, denounced the Republicans, denounced President Bush, in fact it was, for coddling the butchers of Beijing, only during his administration to engage in constructive engagement as president. Why would U.S. voters be swayed by the current pandering against China by the major candidates?
Look, the reality is that once you become president, you look at the national interest in a different way. That does happen. But keep in mind a couple of things. Bill Clinton did pursue a different set of policies, including pretty aggressive free trade policies, more generally with NAFTA in specific terms, and of course by moving China to the top of the agenda in the WTO and in other respects. Now you're getting Democrats basically denouncing their own previous administration's trade policies. And one of the major critiques, the Obama campaign has a flyer out now. The Clinton campaign has a flyer attacking Obama on trade. The Obama campaign has a flyer attacking Clinton on trade. And it raises in that flyer all of the things that she said in support of China and WTO as she suggests that Obama back then was also supporting it. You hope that the rhetoric doesn't get so far along that the candidates can't do much about it, but they're also going to face a different political climate in the Congress, a much more skeptical one about trade agreements than Bill Clinton had when he became president.
Do you think we'll also see in 2009 a Congress more skeptical about military spending? That Iraq, that the aftermath of Iraq will kind of be a more multilateralist, less aggressive posture on the part of the United States?
You know, we're going to have an interesting debate about where we put our defense dollars. And it's one that's going on now as Secretary Gates, the Secretary of Defense, is thinking this through. The fundamental reality here to begin with is even if the war in Iraq ended very soon, we're going to have massive increases in defense spending in the short and medium run. We have a National Guard and reserves that are in tatters. We're going to have equipment replacement costs that are staggering. And we clearly do not have a regular army that is up to speed right now or that has adequate forces. So that need to have more spending in the short run, combined with the discussion about what role we play in the world and where we put our defense dollars, is going to be an interesting debate and an interesting challenge, and a challenge particularly because there's no money to do much of anything now, and unless the economy gets better fairly soon, we're going to have some very tough decisions to make about spending.
From Tulsa. China's reputation in the U.S. has been damaged over the past 12 months. I myself, Jim from Tulsa, I'm now working not to purchase goods made in China. What do you see as the most important thing that China could or should do to improve its image in the United States?
I think certainly let's talk first on the economic front. One of the things that has to happen here is that we perhaps bear a joint responsibility, but China has to do more itself to make sure that we're not getting drugs that are defective or lead in toys or toothpaste or anything else. There has to be a regimen that is not simply done by Americans from the FDA or the Consumer Product Safety Commission going in and trying to inspect those plants, or relying on American companies to do it on their own. It's in China's interest to make it very clear that it has a regulatory regime that can work here. And then more generally, it seems to me that on the international front, I think what I've seen in discussions with Chinese at different levels, which I do not do nearly as much as you or many of our viewers do, there is a tunnel view of Tibet that is going to be, it's probably not going to change, but that is going to exacerbate these relations. But I would come back to, putting that aside because I don't see that as changing, it seems to me that China has to try and do some things in other areas of the world to show that it is not simply on the side of repressive and evil regimes because it's got an economic interest there, that it sees that there has to be at least some attention paid to awful things happening in other places in the world. That would help a lot if China indicated that it was sensitive to genocide in Africa or in Darfur, or repression in Burma. Any of those things would make a difference. And creating a different sense of what role censorship plays in the society would be in China's interest, it seems to me, but also would do a lot towards alleviating some of those concerns here.
Yeah, though the Chinese would say that the progress that they've made on Darfur, and what the U.S. mission to the UN would say, is that the Chinese actually play a very constructive role today on Darfur as opposed to 3 years ago, and they say they get no credit for it. Nobody reports that they're sending 350 engineers, peacekeeping engineers, to work in Darfur, and they say, well, no good deed goes unpunished. There is no doubt a lot going on that we don't know about in a more general sense.
more of that would help, and clearly there ought to be ways, perhaps including through the National Committee, to get those stories out if they're there.
This is one about the political process. It's from New York. In caucus states where organization is key, and especially on the Democratic side, manufacturing labor unions are therefore very important. Are candidates pushed to be more anti-free trade as a result of the structure of the Democratic primary system?
It's a very good point, but I think the fact is that that's true in primary states as well. Look at what's happening in Pennsylvania as we're seeing the unions step in and play an extraordinarily significant role through their independent expenditures. The Service Employees Union is spending a good deal of money on behalf of Barack Obama. The Teamsters now have endorsed him. And some of the more traditional unions, including the municipal employees, are backing Senator Clinton. They're putting money and man and woman power into these states to help get out the vote and to change the dialogue. And so the candidates are very sensitive to the role of unions, even in the primary states, as of course they were with the organizational advantages in the caucus states.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to, this is from Honolulu. I should have said good morning to the, lunch, have a nice lunch in Honolulu. And it relates to an issue you raised. Is China as a convenient target? Is this attitude more fundamental than the earlier choice of Japan as a bashable target, which you referred to in 1988?
I don't know the answer to that. I think, Japan faded a little bit as a target, partly as a consequence of a decade of stagnation, and its replacement as the engine of growth and the future by China. At the same time, Japan was an economic power, but was not a military power, and was prevented by its own constitution from becoming a military power. And of course had a population that wasn't going to grow and that was much less significant. China's much bigger and more significant in many other ways. One could imagine that the great engine of growth in China slows down. Maybe internal divisions between the haves and the have-nots, maybe environmental and transportation problems that emerge, maybe a global slowdown will see its role not quite as significant a little bit further down the road. I don't think that's likely, but it's at least possible. Every time we project a country being, the next emerging leader in the world, we learn that linear projections are not all that accurate.
And the Chinese would share that view. They do not see themselves becoming the number one power. It has been argued that while European countries would prefer a liberal Democratic candidate, that Asian states usually prefer Republicans. Should China be concerned about both or either one of the Democratic candidates becoming president and their potential approach to dealing with China?
I actually think that if you look at all of these difficulties that have emerged, it's not just the campaign, they've emerged in a Republican administration. It's a larger political context. And in some respects, you could make the opposite case, that just as it took a Republican president, Richard Nixon, to change relations at a time when, the opposite argument would have been made, that a Democratic president would have been better for China because a Democrat was not going to be as anti-communist. You might argue now that it's going to take a Democratic president to be able to change this climate with a likely Democratic Congress where he can temper he or she can temper some of the protectionist populist sentiment that will emerge otherwise. But I think we should be realistic here in this sense. Until the economy starts to get a little bit better, we're going to have a tough time no matter who the president is. And in Congress, many of the responsible centrists, the people who have a more nuanced view of China-American relations, some who've left in the last couple of years, like Doug Bereiter, who's now the head of the Asia Foundation, others like Jim Leach, and some who are going to be leaving this time, are going to create an even more ideologically polarized Congress. And that's going to include some populists on the right, the Pat Buchanan-type populists, as well as many on the left. And so it's going to be a difficult terrain for any president, Democrat or Republican.
Well, we have just a few seconds left, so Norm, I wanted to thank you for a fascinating discussion, and you have raised a lot of issues for our speakers to talk about later this evening in all of the venues across the country and in Asia. Norm, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Steve.
It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks.